You're listening to the Aardvark Agenda on Cavan Online Radio with your host, Daniel Downey. Welcome to today's show. This is your host, Daniel Downey, and on today's show we're going to be talking about, yes, you've guessed it, if you haven't heard enough of him, it is Donald Trump. That's right, folks, we haven't really covered anything on Donald Trump in this Aardvark Agenda, so we're going to just cover a little bit. But we're going to be approaching it from a slightly different angle. We're going to be approaching it from Chinese side, Russian side, and the Trump American first side, and letting you decide what you think at the end of it. Yes, with all these facts, alternative facts, and alternative facts, and factual alternatives, it's hard to sift through the truth and find out exactly what the hell is going on. So, first things first, we're going to talk about Trump and China. But first, let's go to this little song.
Let's say China. 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 I have to have my China. 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 I know China very well. China. 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 I'm from China. 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 I have people that I know in China. 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 I'm from China. 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 I have people that I know in China. 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 I've been saying China. 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 I like China. I go to China. 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 Go to China. 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 You went to China. 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 Get a job in China. I know China. I love China. 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 China, 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 China all the time. China, 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 China. And by the way, I love China.
Indeed, he does. That's Donald Trump, and the amount of times he said China, he must be surely obsessed with China in some way. He's often said that China has raped America of its industry, commerce, and economic potential. Mostly he sees this in the same way that you might see America as being the powerhouse of economic power in the 20th century, and China is rapidly overtaking it. It may have something to do with the fact that China can produce goods at much, much cheaper rates than America can. I mean, considering what's paid, the cost of living, etc., 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 and the sheer population. You're talking 1 billion people. Now, I've been to China twice. I've never been to the United States. But what my experience is of China is that they are an incredibly industrious people. That's something probably they have in common with the Americans. Both are very hard-working people. They want to try and get the job done. They're all about getting hard work, getting work done, and getting the product out and getting it out on a deadline. They're very kind of ferociously industrious like that. Much different to, for example, many of us Europeans or other Asian peoples who are, particularly Indians, who are more about, living and about kind of sitting back, and it's about you live to work or you work to live. It's that philosophy. And you know what, I think the Chinese and the Americans have one thing and one thing in common. Many of them are ferocious people who live to work. They need a drive in their lives, and Donald Trump sees this drive in the Chinese economy in the last few years as something which is a threat to him. But the translation of that threat seems to come down to something which is altogether more terrifying for us in the world today, and that is the potential of a Chinese-American war, or Sino-American war, as they say. So it's a terrifying idea. We're going to have a couple of clips here to kind of describe exactly what's going on. We have, first of all, tensions between the Chinese and US over Taiwan and why Taiwan is actually quite important to keep an eye on. So have a listen to this, folks, and we'll be back in a moment.
Taiwan has a constitution, an army, and an elected government, yet the United Nations doesn't formally recognize it. The reason? China considers the island one of its provinces, the government as illegitimate, and talk of independence deeply hostile. A new president in Taipei from the independent-leaning Democratic Progressive Party is testing China's tolerance, as is a new president in Washington. Here's the situation. Taiwan's first female president, Tsai Ing-wen, provoked an angry response from China by speaking to Donald Trump by telephone after he was elected. In deference to the Beijing government, no US leader has talked directly to a Taiwan president in almost 4 decades. Tsai says she wants peaceful ties with China while resisting pressure to acknowledge the One China principle.
两岸之间应该要尽快坐下来谈。
That principle has underpinned relations with China in the past. It's the understanding that both sides belong to one China, even if they have different ideas about what that means. Trump says his support for a one China policy hinges on cutting a better trade deal with China, prompting a complaint from the Chinese government.
I don't know why we have to be bound by a one China policy unless we make a deal with China.
Tsai is promising to follow public opinion on China. Polls show strong support for maintaining the status quo of coexistence and little immediate interest in independence. Here's the argument. Taiwan's 23.5 million people have built their economy into a technology and manufacturing powerhouse, with average income 3 times that of China's and much of Apple's iPhone made there. Voters turned to Tsai to keep the peace while building international ties, with a view to a future less dependent on the mainland. While many China watchers say there's too much at stake for military confrontation, Trump's election has added a degree of uncertainty to the old assumptions. An increasingly assertive China aims more than 1,200 missiles at Taiwan, and no peace treaty has been signed in the 7 decades since the government split. For the US, some analysts say supporting the One China policy has allowed it to sell weapons to Taiwan, and that's helped deter China from attempting to retake the island by force.
Well, there you have a brief summary of exactly what the situation is as regards the United States, China and Taiwan, which is a pivotal element. And we'll be talking more a little bit about the deal that Trump refers to about a one China policy. And the other issue that comes into play here is the South China Sea issue, and that's where the islands that are in dispute are being invented and claimed by China. They're building islands in South China Sea as military bases to forward their potential or maximise their potential in the Southeast Asian areas. And it's quite an undertaking. Now, on the one side, you can say that this is an aggressive Chinese move to try and move into the South Pacific and threaten neighbouring countries. On the other hand, you can also say, what right does the United States have to intervene in a sea which is the South China Sea on the other side of the planet from themselves? Now, they've always called themselves the policemen of the world, or had that title thrust upon them, but at the same time, it is an infringement on the rights of one country to expand itself in the same footsteps that the United States have expanded themselves throughout the history of the United States since the 1850s to 1900s. It wasn't that long ago that the Philippines, for example, was a colony of the United States. And its colonization efforts went on and on and on under the guise of the Cold War, for example, in Vietnam and other countries. They just step in. And then that comes up to modern times with the Arab Springs in the Middle East and North Africa. So America is not entirely guiltless in this entire situation. But coming back to this, we do have an issue with a potential war in the South China Sea in regards to Taiwan, but also in regards to these islands, because Chinese have said that under a blockade situation, if they are blockaded by the United States from reaching these new island bases, they will not back down in the same way that the USSR backed down in the Cuban Missile Crisis. They will engage American warships. And the Americans have dispatched 3 aircraft carriers in the last week to the region to try and enforce the peace. What level of enforcement, that will be up to the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, the very capable, sane and moderate man, Donald J. Trump. So let's hear a little bit from China's response to some of these issues, which has recently been brought to, I think this is the BBC, in the last few days.
The Chinese government does not like to show its cards. Generally, when you ask for interviews, they're either declined or they take a very long time, or you get written statements in Chinese. But what we got this time was an actual sit-down interview with a senior foreign ministry official. And I think it's because of the urgency many people in this country feel, and the government feels, now that Donald Trump is making so many rapid-fire appointments and so many rapid-fire decisions. And China, frankly, doesn't want to be left out. It wants to lay down its markers. It wants its public priorities to be known and to be clear so that there is no confusions or, even worse, a potential escalation of a trade war or even a military escalation. And really, there were two main priorities that we discussed in this interview with the Foreign Ministry spokesman, Lu Kong. The first one was about the controversy over China's building in the South China Sea. If you remember yesterday at the press briefing, the new White House press secretary said that the United States would challenge China over its fortification of islands in the South China Sea in order to build military bases. China today wanted to stress that it sees that as a national priority, and effectively the U.S. should back down. And the second point, on which China was even more emphatic, was over its so-called one China policy. There's a big concern that the United States, that President Trump will recognize Taiwan, something that China does not do and does not want the United States to do. How would China respond if the U.S. takes more steps, if President Trump takes more steps to recognize Taiwan?
I'm not here to prejudge anything, but we made our positions very clear. 2 points. First, this one China policy has been the fundamental basis for China-American relationship. Second, because this issue touches upon China's core interests, by no means this is something that could be negotiated or at a bargaining chip.
So that sounds like there's no room for discussion from your perspective on that.
One China policy.
100%.
100%.
As you remember, Andrea, shortly after his election, President Trump received a phone call from the Taiwanese leader. China was incensed by that, so much so that they sent military aircraft buzzing very near to Taiwan. They sent an aircraft carrier coasting by not far from the Taiwanese shoreline. So this is something that China wants to make explicitly clear, so that there are no misunderstandings now or in the future that it sees as something of a red line.
So there we have a particular situation in China, and it's 100% unbargainable, unnegotiable. It is a Chinese national policy that they expand in the South China Sea, and it is a one China, unnegotiable policy that Taiwan is part of China and not to be recognized by any international. Even the United Nations do not recognize Taiwan as an independent nation, but the American president does. Well, that brings us to the end of the Chinese slot, and we're moving on now to the other perspective, which is the Russian perspective of how things have changed. And the geopolitical climate has radically changed in the last few years, so much so that that famous or infamous doomsday clock is now the second closest it has ever been to the potential for a Third World War. The closest was back in 1954. I believe it was something to do with the Korean War, when Russia, China and the United States were in tensions with one another over the peninsula of Korea. But at the moment, Russia is flexing its arms again, and it's almost like we're back in a semi-Cold War state. Not particularly between the USSR and Trump, but between the USSR and certain neighbouring countries, and certainly between Russia and NATO, not the USSR, of course. But it is almost like we're back in the USSR, and, well, speaking of that, let's have a little bit of that song to break things up. Back after this.